The roar came first. A sound unlike anything heard over European skies before. Deep, guttural, almost animalistic. Luftwaffe pilots called it the voice of death. They would hear it cutting through clouds at 20,000 feet, and experienced aces, men with 50 kills to their names, would break formation and dive for cover. This was not cowardice. This was survival instinct born from watching their squadron mates torn apart by a machine that seemed to defy every rule of aerial combat. The aircraft had bent wings that looked backward, a nose so long it seemed impossible to see past, and an engine that produced more power than anything Germany could build. When it dove, it didn't just fall. It screamed. And when its 6 guns opened fire, the sky itself seemed to shatter. What was this American monster that turned the hunters into the hunted? Why did veteran pilots with Knights Crosses refuse missions when they learned it was in the area? And how did one bent-winged fighter break the spine of the Luftwaffe's most decorated squadrons? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The date was March 14, 1944. The sky above Rabaul hung heavy with tropical heat and the smoke of burning fuel. For months, this fortress in the South Pacific had been the pride of Japanese naval aviation. Hundreds of Zeros operated from its airstrips, flown by pilots who had cut their teeth over China and perfected their craft in the opening days of the Pacific War. They were confident, skilled, and utterly unprepared for what was about to arrive. At 1100 hours, radar operators detected an incoming formation. Large. Flying high. The scramble order went out immediately. 43 Zeros clawed into the sky, their pilots eager. American bombers meant easy kills, fat targets lumbering through the air waiting to be shredded. But as the Japanese fighters climbed through 15,000 feet, something felt wrong. The formation was too tight. Too aggressive. These were not bombers. Then they saw them. Dark blue shapes cutting through the cloud layer like sharks through water. The wings were all wrong, angled backward in a gull configuration that looked like some engineer's fever dream. The noses stretched impossibly long, housing engines that even from a distance sounded different. Louder. Angrier. Meaner. The lead Zero pilot, a veteran named Saburo Sakai who would survive the war to write about this day, made his approach from above. Standard tactics. Dive on the formation, select a target, one quick burst, then climb away using superior maneuverability. He had done this hundreds of times. He rolled inverted and pushed the stick forward. What happened next rewrote everything he thought he knew about air combat. The American formation didn't scatter. They didn't break. Instead, in perfect coordination, every single aircraft pushed into a dive. Not a gentle descent. A full power, nose down, vertical plunge that accelerated so violently it seemed to violate physics. Sakai's Zero, already at maximum speed in its dive, was suddenly being left behind. Impossible. Nothing could outdive a Zero. Nothing. He watched helplessly as the dark blue fighters pulled away, accelerating past 400 miles per hour, then 450, then 500. His Zero was shaking itself apart at 380. He had to pull out or die. As he leveled off, gasping against the G-forces, he saw one of the American machines roll inverted 2,000 feet below him, pull through an impossibly tight turn, and begin climbing back toward him. Climbing. While maintaining speed. His mind couldn't process it. The 6 guns in that aircraft's wings opened fire. 50 caliber rounds, each one the size of a man's thumb, came at him in a stream so dense it looked like a solid beam of light. His wingman, flying just 50 yards to his right, simply disintegrated. One moment there was a Zero. The next there was debris tumbling through the air and a spreading cloud of fuel mist catching fire. Sakai broke left, pulling as hard as his aircraft could manage. The American fighter followed effortlessly. He tried every trick he knew. Chandelle. Split S, barrel roll. The dark shape stayed on him, matching every move, closing the distance. Then it did something that should have been impossible. It accelerated in the turn, gaining speed while pulling G-forces that should have torn its wings off. Only a desperate dive into cloud cover saved him. When he emerged, shaking, his fuel gauge near empty, he counted the returning zeros. 29. 14 had been lost in less than 12 minutes. Not a single American aircraft had gone down. The pilots who made it back sat in their ready rooms, silent, staring at nothing. They had just met the F-4U Corsair. And they knew with absolute certainty that the war had changed. But this was not the Corsair's first dance with death. Its journey to the skies above Rabaul had been long, troubled, and nearly ended before it began. To understand why German and Japanese pilots feared it so completely, we must go back 3 years earlier, to a drafty hangar in Connecticut where engineers were attempting to marry the largest engine ever fitted to a fighter aircraft with an airframe that could survive the forces such power would unleash. The story began in February 1938 when the United States Navy issued a request that seemed almost fantastical. They wanted a carrier-based fighter that could reach 400 miles per hour, climb to 20,000 feet in under 10 minutes, and carry enough fuel to escort bombers on long-range strikes. These requirements were so far beyond existing aircraft that most manufacturers didn't even bother submitting proposals. The technology simply didn't exist. But one company saw possibility where others saw impossibility. Chance Vought Aircraft, led by chief designer Rex Beisel, had been experimenting with high-powered engines and unconventional airframe designs. When Pratt & Whitney unveiled their new OR 2800 double WASP engine, producing an unprecedented 2,000 horsepower, Beisel saw his opportunity. If he could build an aircraft around this monster of an engine, he could meet every one of the Navy's impossible demands. The problems were immediate and profound. The OR 2800 was massive, requiring a propeller over 13 feet in diameter to absorb its power. But carrier aircraft needed short landing gear to fit in the cramped hangars of aircraft carriers. Short gear meant the propeller would strike the deck during takeoff and landing. Every conventional solution failed. Extending the gear made it too weak. Shrinking the propeller wasted the engine's power. For months, the project seemed doomed. Then Beisel made a decision that would define the Corsair's appearance and, eventually, its legend. He bent the wings. Instead of a straight wing extending from the fuselage, he created an inverted gull configuration. The wing angled sharply downward from the fuselage root, then bent back to horizontal at the point where the landing gear attached. This accomplished two things. It allowed shorter, stronger landing gear while maintaining propeller clearance. And it reduced drag by allowing the wing to fuselage joint to be nearly perpendicular, creating a cleaner aerodynamic profile. The design looked strange. Ungainly even. Navy test pilots took one look at the mock-up and nicknamed it the Ensign Eliminator, suggesting it would kill fresh academy graduates before the enemy ever got a chance. But Beisel's calculations showed promise. On paper, at least, his bent-wing bird would fly. The prototype, designated XF-4U-1, first flew on May 29, 1940. Test pilot Lyman A. Bullard Jr. climbed into the cockpit of a machine that looked like it had been designed by a committee that couldn't agree on anything. The fuselage stretched 18 feet before reaching the wing, housing that enormous engine and its massive propeller. The cockpit sat so far back that forward visibility was virtually non-existent. The oil cooler intakes in the wing roots looked like gaping mouths. Everything about it seemed wrong. Bullard pushed the throttle forward. The sound was unlike anything heard before at the airfield. Not the smooth whine of existing fighters but a raw, brutal roar. The Corsair began to roll, slowly at first, then with building momentum. At 70 miles per hour, Bullard pulled back on the stick. The nose came up reluctantly. The ground dropped away. And suddenly, impossibly, he was flying. What happened in the next hour sent shockwaves through the aviation world. Bullard pushed the Corsair to 405 miles per hour in level flight. No American fighter had ever come close. He climbed to 10,000 feet in less than 5 minutes. He threw the aircraft through rolls, loops, and dives that should have torn the wings off. The Corsair absorbed it all. When he landed, his report was simple. "This thing is a rocket with wings." The Navy immediately ordered 584 production models. Finally, they believed, they had the carrier fighter that would dominate the Pacific. But as production aircraft began rolling off the assembly line in 1942, a new set of problems emerged. Problems so severe that the Corsair almost never made it to combat. Carrier trials were a disaster. The long nose made it nearly impossible for pilots to see the landing signal officer during approach. The aircraft had a tendency to stall without warning in the tight turns required for carrier operations. When it did stall, one wing would drop violently, and if this happened close to the deck, there was no time to recover. In the first month of trials, 3 pilots died. The Navy began to have serious doubts. Worse, the Corsair developed a terrifying characteristic that pilots called the Corsair snap. During hard turns, particularly during landing approach, the aircraft would suddenly and without warning snap into a violent roll. Sometimes left. Sometimes right. Unpredictable. Several pilots were killed before engineers discovered the cause. Airflow over the bent wing was stalling unevenly, creating a momentary but catastrophic loss of lift on one side. The solution required months of modifications. Stall strips on the leading edge. Raised spoilers. A redesigned tailhook. Each fix helped, but the Corsair remained what test pilots called a hot aircraft. Demanding. Unforgiving. Deadly to the inexperienced. By late 1942, the Navy made a controversial decision. The Corsair would not be used on carriers. Instead, it would be assigned to Marine Corps squadrons operating from land bases in the Pacific. For many involved in the program, this felt like failure. All that work, all that innovation, and the fighter couldn't do the one thing it had been designed for. But this decision, born from frustration and safety concerns, would inadvertently create a legend. Because operating from land bases meant Marine pilots could take full advantage of the Corsair's strengths without worrying about its carrier landing quirks. And it meant the aircraft would be flying from forward positions, exactly where the fighting was fiercest. The Corsair was about to prove that sometimes the most fearsome weapons are the ones that were never supposed to exist in the first place. The first Marine squadron to receive Corsairs was VMF 124, commanded by Major William E. Guise. In January 1943, they began training at Camp Kearny in California. The pilots, most of them combat veterans from Guadalcanal, approached their new mounts with a mixture of excitement and trepidation. They had heard the stories. Fast. Powerful. Dangerous. The training process was unlike anything they had experienced. The Corsair demanded respect. Throttle control had to be smooth and progressive. Snap the throttle open too quickly and the massive torque would flip the aircraft on its back during takeoff. Landing required precise speed control. Too fast and you would float halfway down the runway. Too slow and the stall would kill you. The visibility problem was addressed through a curving approach, keeping the runway in sight through the side of the canopy until the last possible moment, then straightening just before touchdown. Pilots learned to love and fear the machine in equal measure. Second Lieutenant Kenneth Walsh, who would eventually become one of the Corsair's greatest aces, described his first flight as like riding a barely controlled explosion. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The acceleration was intoxicating. The climb rate absurd. But every advantage came with a corresponding danger. The same power that could take you from sea level to 20,000 feet in under 8 minutes could also snap your neck if you pulled too hard on the stick during a high-speed turn. By September 1943, VMF 124 was declared combat ready. They shipped out to the South Pacific, specifically to the Solomon Islands, where Japanese air power was still strong and aggressive. The Marines were eager to prove their difficult aircraft could perform. The Japanese, unaware of what was coming, continued their operations as usual. The stage was set for the Corsair's combat debut. That debut came on September 14, 1943. A strike package of Marine bombers was hitting Japanese positions on Ball Island. VMF-124 provided escort, 16 Corsairs flying top cover at 22,000 feet. The Japanese sent up 30 Zeros to intercept. For the Marines, it was the moment of truth. All the training, all the crashes, all the near-death experiences learning to fly this beast. Now they would find out if it was worth it. The Zeros climbed to engage, confident as always. They had fought American Wildcats and found them inferior in everything but durability. They expected the same from these new aircraft. But as the Marines dove to meet them, the Zero's pilots realized immediately that something was very different. The dark blue fighters didn't just dive. They fell like thrown spears, accelerating past 500 miles per hour before the Japanese could even react. The Corsairs blew through the Zero formation, guns blazing, then pulled up and climbed back to altitude faster than the Zeros could follow. In the first engagement, 4 Zeros were destroyed. Not a single Corsair was even hit. The Marines had discovered what would become their standard tactic. Use the Corsair's superior speed and climb rate to control the engagement. Dive. Attack. Climb. Repeat. Never try to turn with the Zero. Never slow down. The Corsair was not a dancer. It was a bludgeon. And in the hands of pilots who understood this, it was absolutely lethal. Word spread quickly through Japanese bases. A new American fighter had arrived. Faster than anything they possessed. More heavily armed. Nearly impossible to catch or escape from. Pilots who survived encounters with the Corsair reported the same thing. The sound. That distinctive roar that announced its presence long before it appeared. Japanese ground crews could identify a Corsair by engine sound alone, and when they did, they would sound different alerts. The whistling death, they began calling it, though the whistle they referred to was actually the sound of air passing through the oil cooler intakes at high speed during a dive. To those on the ground, it sounded like an incoming bomb. To those in the air, it was a death sentence. But the real test was yet to come. Because while the Corsair was dominating the Pacific, cutting a swath through Japanese air power that would eventually result in an 11-to-1 kill ratio, the aircraft's reputation had reached Europe. And there, in the cold skies over Germany, veteran Luftwaffe pilots were about to discover that the American fighter was even more terrifying than the reports suggested. The winter of 1944 brought a strange quiet to the airfields of southern England. American bomber formations still departed each morning, their contrails writing stories of destruction across European skies. But something had shifted in the Luftwaffe's response. Interception rates were declining. German fighters that once rose in massive formations to challenge every raid were becoming selective, cautious, almost timid. Allied intelligence officers pored over reports, trying to understand the change. The answer would not become clear until months later, when captured documents and interrogated pilots revealed a stunning truth. The Luftwaffe was avoiding combat not because they lacked fuel or aircraft, but because they were terrified of a specific American fighter that had begun appearing over the continent. The Corsair's arrival in Europe was never part of the original plan. The aircraft belonged to the Pacific Theater, where Marine squadrons had already established its reputation as the most lethal fighter in the sky. But in late 1943, the Royal Navy found itself desperate for modern carrier fighters. Their Seafires, while capable, were fragile and unsuited for the brutal demands of carrier operations. When the British heard about the Corsair's performance in the Pacific, they requested Lend-Lease deliveries despite knowing about its troubled carrier landing history. British test pilots, perhaps more experienced with difficult aircraft or simply more willing to accept casualties, found they could manage the Corsair's quirks. By early 1944, Fleet Air Arm squadrons were flying the fighter from carriers in the Atlantic and Mediterranean. It was during operations off Norway in April 1944 that European Luftwaffe pilots first encountered the bent-wing American. British Corsairs were escorting a strike against German shipping when FW-190s from Jägerschwader 5 rose to intercept. The German pilots were elite, hand-picked for Arctic operations, experienced in attacking Allied convoys. They expected another routine engagement. What they got was carnage. The combat report filed by Oberleutnant Heinrich Oehler, a veteran with over 200 kills to his name, described an aircraft that seemed to operate under different physical laws than German fighters. He wrote that the Corsairs dove on his formation from above, achieving speeds he estimated at well over 600 km per hour. His FW-190s, among the fastest fighters Germany possessed, were simply outrun. When he attempted to climb away, the American aircraft followed, matching his climb rate while maintaining speed. When he tried to turn, expecting to use the FW-190's superior roll rate, the Corsair stayed with him through the first turn, then simply accelerated away in the second, climbing vertically before rolling back to attack again. Most disturbing to Oehler was the firepower. He had seen his wingman's aircraft hit by what he assumed was cannon fire. The FW-190 had come apart in mid-air. Only later did he learn the Corsair carried no cannons, only machine guns. 650 caliber Brownings, each capable of firing 800 rounds per minute. When all six converged on a target, the weight of fire was equivalent to a medium bomber's defensive battery. German aircraft, built lighter to maximize performance, could not withstand such punishment. A 1-second burst from a Corsair delivered 60 rounds. Most German fighters were destroyed or crippled by fewer than 20 hits. The psychological effect was immediate and profound. Oehler recommended that his pilots avoid engaging Corsairs unless absolutely necessary and only with significant numerical advantage. Other squadron commanders issued similar directives. By summer 1944, Luftwaffe briefings included specific recognition training for the Corsair, emphasizing its bent wing profile and long nose. Pilots were instructed that if Corsairs were identified in the combat area, the mission priorities were to be reassessed. Bomber interception suddenly became less important than survival. But it was over Germany itself where the Corsair's reputation truly calcified into legend. American Navy squadrons, frustrated by the slow pace of carrier operations and eager for action, volunteered their Corsairs for temporary assignment to the 8th Air Force. The proposal was unusual. Navy fighters operating under Army Air Force Command, flying missions deep into German territory from English bases. But the results in the Pacific had been so overwhelming that objections were swept aside. In June 1944, the 1st Navy Corsair Squadron arrived at a base in Suffolk. The Luftwaffe, monitoring Allied radio traffic, learned of the new arrivals. Intelligence officers reviewed combat reports from Norway and the Pacific. They reached an unsettling conclusion. The Corsair was not simply another fighter. It represented a fundamental shift in aviation technology. German engineering had reached its practical limits. The Bf-109 and FW-190, as refined as they were, could not match the raw power and performance that American industry was now producing. This was more than a tactical problem. It was an existential one. On July 7, 1944, a massive bomber stream departed England heading for Munich. 300 B-17s, escorted by P-51 Mustangs and, for the first time over Germany, 12 Navy F-4U Corsairs. The Luftwaffe response was significant. Over 100 fighters rose to intercept, primarily Bf-109G models from elite units that had been pulled back to defend the Reich. These were not green pilots. Many had flown since 1940. They knew every trick, every tactic, every advantage their aircraft possessed. The initial engagement unfolded as expected. Mustangs dueled with 109s in the classic fighter combat that had characterized the air war for years. Then the Corsairs arrived. They had been flying high cover, 7,000 feet above the main escort force. When German fighters committed to attacking the bombers, the Corsairs rolled inverted and dropped like stones. What followed was not combat. It was execution. The Corsairs came down so fast that German pilots had no time to react. By the time they saw the dark shapes dropping through their formations, the American fighters were already firing. 50 caliber rounds shredded wings and fuselages. Aircraft simply exploded or broke apart. The Corsairs didn't stop. They pulled through the bomber stream, climbed vertically on the other side, rolled at the top, and came back for another pass. All of this happened in less than 2 minutes. Major Walter Nowotny, one of the Luftwaffe's most decorated aces, was leading a group that day. His combat report, filed that evening, was shockingly candid. He described an aircraft that combined the speed of a rocket with the armament of a destroyer. He noted that his pilots, veterans all, had been completely unable to maneuver defensively. The Corsair's attack profile was simple and unstoppable. Dive, fire, climb away. There was no counter. Attempting to turn only made you a slower target. Attempting to run only prolonged the inevitable. Attempting to climb was suicide. Nowotny wrote something else that caught the attention of higher command. He stated plainly that if Corsairs became a regular feature of American escort missions, he could not guarantee his squadron's survival. This was extraordinary. Nowotny had over 250 kills. He had fought on every front. He was not prone to exaggeration or defeatism. And he was saying, in official documents, that a single American fighter type had changed the equation so dramatically that experienced German pilots could not compete. Within days, similar reports came from other units. The commander of WWII, one of the Luftwaffe's founding fighter wings, requested permission to decline missions when Corsairs were known to be present. His request was denied, but the fact he made it at all revealed the depth of concern. Pilots who had faced Spitfires and Thunderbolts and Mustangs without hesitation were now genuinely afraid of an aircraft most had never even seen up close. The fear was not irrational. By August 1944, Corsairs operating over Europe had achieved a kill ratio exceeding 15-1. For every Corsair lost, 15 German aircraft went down. More significantly, the Corsairs were causing German formations to break off attacks before reaching bombers. The mere presence of the bent-wing fighters was enough to disrupt carefully planned interceptions. Luftwaffe controllers could be heard on radio intercepts warning their pilots about Corsairs in the area, treating them the same way they would an overwhelming numerical disadvantage. Captured German pilots provided even more insight. A Bf-109 pilot shot down in September, his leg shattered by 50 caliber rounds, was asked during interrogation what he thought of American fighters. His answer was direct. The Mustang is a good aircraft. We can fight it. The Thunderbolt is dangerous but slow in climb. We can fight it. The Corsair is from hell. You cannot fight it. You can only hope it does not see you. Another pilot, an ace from WWII 52 with over 60 kills, described his only encounter with a Corsair. He had been bounced from above while returning from a mission. The Corsair made one pass. Just one. His wingman was gone. His own aircraft was so riddled with holes he barely made it back to base. He never saw where the shots came from. The Corsair had appeared, fired, and vanished in less than 3 seconds. He requested a transfer to a different front the next day. But the most telling moment came in late October 1944 when a group of senior Luftwaffe pilots attended a briefing in Berlin. The topic was tactical responses to American escort fighters. When the discussion turned to the Corsair, Major Gerhard Barkhorn, the second highest scoring ace in history with over 300 kills, stood and made a statement that shocked everyone present. He said simply that there was no tactical response to the Corsair when properly flown. Its performance envelope was so far beyond German aircraft that conventional fighter tactics were irrelevant. The only viable response was to avoid combat entirely and focus on targets the Corsair could not protect. This was not the statement of a coward. Barkhorn had flown over 1,000 combat missions. He had survived years of brutal air combat on the Eastern Front. But he recognized what others were reluctant to admit. Germany had lost the technological race. The Corsair was proof. Behind this technological disparity lay a story of industrial capacity and engineering philosophy that illuminated why Germany was losing the war. The Corsairs R-2800 engine produced 2,000 horsepower in 1943 and could be pushed to 2,400 horsepower with water injection by 1945. Germany's best fighter engine, the DB605 and the Bf-109, produced 1,400 horsepower and could not be significantly improved without catastrophic reliability issues. This was not a failure of German engineering. It was a failure of resources. The R-2800 required specific high-grade alloys, precision manufacturing to tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch, and production facilities that had not been bombed into rubble. Germany in 1944 had none of these advantages. They were producing engines with inferior materials, in damaged factories, using slave labor that had every incentive to sabotage production. The result was fighters that were, on paper, still competitive but in practice were slowly being outclassed in every measurable way. Fuel was another critical factor. The Corsair burned high-octane aviation fuel that allowed its engine to operate at higher manifold pressures without detonating. German fighters ran on synthetic fuel produced from coal, lower in quality, forcing engines to operate at reduced power settings. A Bf-109 that could theoretically reach 600 km per hour was lucky to achieve 550 with the fuel available in 1944. The Corsair, meanwhile, could routinely exceed 700 km per hour in a dive and maintain 550 in level flight. Armament told a similar story. Each of the Corsair's 6 machine guns was fed by an ammunition system that virtually never jammed. German weapons, particularly the 20mm cannons, were prone to stoppages caused by cold, G-forces, or simple mechanical failure. A Corsair pilot could fire continuously until ammunition was exhausted. A German pilot often got 1 or 2 bursts before his weapons failed. In the chaos of combat, reliability mattered more than theoretical superiority. But perhaps the most significant advantage was one rarely mentioned in performance specifications. The Corsair was built by workers who went home to comfortable houses, ate well, and believed in what they were building. German aircraft in late 1944 were assembled by starving prisoners who knew every rivet they failed to install properly, every wire they deliberately crossed, brought the war closer to ending. Quality control was impossible under such conditions. Aircraft left factories with defects that would only reveal themselves in combat. Engines failed after a fraction of their rated hours. Hydraulic systems leaked. Electrical systems sparked and died. German pilots knew this. They understood they were flying aircraft that might kill them even if the enemy never fired a shot. This knowledge, combined with facing American fighters that seemed to never break down, never run out of ammunition, never fail when pushed to the limits of performance, created a psychological burden that was devastating to morale. By November 1944, the Luftwaffe was implementing a strategy they called Sturmbach, heavily armored FW-190s designed to penetrate bomber formations and destroy B-17s with heavy cannon fire. These aircraft sacrificed speed and maneuverability for protection and firepower. They were supposed to ignore enemy fighters and focus solely on bombers. But the tactic failed immediately when Corsairs were present. The heavily armored FW-190s were simply too slow to escape when bounced. They became easy targets for fighters that could dive on them at 600 miles per hour and climb away before the escorts could react. Pilots assigned to Sturmbach units began reporting sick at unprecedented rates. Some refused to fly at all. Courts-martial were convened but ultimately proved counterproductive. You cannot shoot your way to air superiority. By December, the program was quietly abandoned. The official reason was fuel shortages. The real reason, documented in captured records after the war, was that veteran pilots had collectively decided they would not fly suicide missions against an enemy that held every advantage. The final proof of the Corsair's psychological impact came during the Battle of the Bulge. The Luftwaffe launched Operation Bodenplatte on January 1, 1945. Throwing every available fighter against Allied airfields in a desperate attempt to destroy aircraft on the ground. Over 900 German fighters participated in the attack. It achieved tactical surprise and destroyed significant numbers of Allied planes. But the cost was catastrophic. Germany lost 300 fighters and, more critically, over 200 experienced pilots. Many of these losses came from Corsairs that scrambled during the attack. One Corsair pilot, Lieutenant Robert Wade, achieved ace status in a single day during Bodenplatte. He shot down 5 German aircraft in 15 minutes. His combat report described German fighters that seemed confused and hesitant, breaking off attacks even when they had favorable positions. Post-war interrogations revealed why. The German pilots had expected to strafe defenseless aircraft on the ground. When they saw Corsairs taking off and climbing toward them, many simply fled. Years of combat reports, pilots' accounts, and official warnings had created a mythology around the American fighter. German pilots, already exhausted and demoralized, could not overcome their fear. The Luftwaffe never recovered from Bodenplatte. The pilots lost that day could not be replaced. But more than that, the will to fight had been broken. In the remaining months of the war, German fighters increasingly stayed on the ground even when fuel was available. When they did fly, they avoided combat unless absolutely necessary. The Corsair had not single-handedly won the air war. But it had become the symbol of American technological and industrial superiority, a physical manifestation of why Germany could not win. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.